and I expect compliance immediately.
Acceptable according to neighborhood covenants.
Too far, and the world holds its breath to see what happens next. Darvell had been a quiet man his entire adult life. 43 years of quiet. Quiet in school when the other kids laughed at his second-hand clothes. Quiet at his first job when his supervisor took credit for his designs. Quiet when his ex-wife left and took half of everything he'd spent a decade building. But when Greta Halsenbach parked her pearl-white Cadillac in his private driveway on a Tuesday evening, no note, no call, no permission, and then had the audacity to show up at his door the next morning with a citation clipboard and a smirk that belonged on a villain in a courtroom drama, Darvell Akin decided that his days of being quiet were finished. He had bought the house on Cedarfield Lane 3 years ago, a modest two-story with a detached garage and a private driveway that sat behind a wrought iron gate he'd installed himself post by post on a cold October weekend. The gate was the first thing he'd built that truly felt like his. It was not decorative, it was not a suggestion. It was a boundary, and like all real boundaries, it meant something. The Cedarfield Homeowners Association had been run by Greta Halsenbach for 11 years. The neighbors said she had been elected 5 times, though 3 of those elections were uncontested because no one wanted the job and no one wanted to fight her for it. She was a woman of organized precision and selective enforcement. The Hendersons next door had been fined twice for their garden hose being coiled on the wrong side of the steps. The Malvo family at the end of the block received a written warning about the color of their mailbox, which Greta had classified as non-compliant beige. Meanwhile, her own front yard featured a fountain with a stone cherub that violated 3 separate sections of the community aesthetic guidelines she herself had written. Darvell had documented all of it, not out of spite, or at least not at first. He documented it the way he documented everything, methodically, with timestamps and photographs stored in labeled folders on his laptop. He was a structural engineer. Evidence was the language he thought in. The evening of the parking incident, he had returned home from a site visit to find Greta's Cadillac sitting squarely in his driveway, partially blocking the gate he'd left open that morning. He stood at the end of his driveway for a full 90 seconds, looking at the car, then at the house, then back at the car. He checked the license plate against his memory. White Cadillac DTS, GHB 4490. Yes, it was hers. He took photographs. He checked the time, 6:47 p.m. He called the non-emergency police line and was told that since it was a private driveway, they could send someone in 3 to 4 hours. He said thank you and hung up. Then he went inside, made himself a bowl of lentil soup, and sat at his kitchen table thinking. His thinking was not emotional, it was architectural. He had been planning a renovation of his back patio for 6 weeks. The materials had arrived that very morning: 40 bags of fast-setting concrete, a load of cinder blocks, lumber, and wire mesh, all stacked neatly in his garage alongside his rented mixer and tools. The project was a retaining wall for a raised garden bed along the eastern edge of his property. He had a permit. He had a plan drawn to scale. He had a weekend blocked off starting Thursday. He looked at the clock. It was barely 7 in the evening. He was not a reckless man. He sat with the thought for a long time. He turned it over the way you turn a stone over to see what lives beneath it. He asked himself whether this was reasonable. He asked himself whether this would cause harm. Then he asked himself a third question, the one that finally made him put down his spoon and push back his chair: what would happen if he did nothing? He knew the answer. Greta Halsenbach would collect her car in the morning. She would receive no consequence. She would return to her routine of writing citations and holding sway over the neighborhood. She would never think about this evening again. Darvell went to his garage. He had not built walls without thought. He had spent 20 years calculating loads and tolerances and material behavior. He knew exactly how high a wall needed to be to completely encircle a standard wheelbase vehicle. He knew the curing time of fast-set concrete in 55-degree weather. He knew how long the night was and how early Greta Halsenbach woke up, because she had once slid a noise complaint under his door referencing sounds he'd made at 7:15 a.m. on a Saturday, which told him she was awake and observant before 7. He started at 8 o'clock. The gate of his property was wrought iron, not wood, which meant it would remain closed and locked around the perimeter while he worked inside the driveway. The Cadillac sat in the center, perhaps 18 feet from nose to trunk. He didn't need to build around the engine block. He just needed to build enough to make the point unmistakable. He mixed the first batch at 8:04. The sound of the mixer was low and rhythmic, not unlike a washing machine, and at this hour on a Tuesday the neighborhood was quiet enough that it wouldn't draw attention. He wore his work clothes, steel-toed boots, canvas pants, the old gray shirt with the structural firm logo peeling off the chest. He worked without music. He needed to think, and thinking required silence. The footing went down first. A narrow concrete strip about 4 inches thick, laid in a rectangle around the Cadillac at a distance of roughly 3 feet from the car's body on all sides. He used his level obsessively, the way he always did on any pour. If you're going to do something, you do it correctly. That was the principle he had lived by since the age of 19, when his first supervisor told him that the difference between a good engineer and a mediocre one was not intelligence, it was discipline. By 9:30, the footing had begun to set. He started laying block. The cinder blocks were 8-inch standard units. He had more than enough. He laid the first course in the traditional running bond pattern, staggered joints, pressing each block into a generous bed of mortar with the flat of his gloved palm. He worked steadily. His back ached between the shoulder blades the way it always did when he'd been bent over a work surface too long, and he rotated every 40 minutes to stretch against the side of the garage. He had not told anyone what he was doing. His neighbor on the east side, a retired machinist named Corvin Phelps, sometimes sat on his back porch late in the evenings, but his porch light was off tonight and his house was dark. On the west side lived the Subramaniam family, a young couple with a toddler who were almost certainly asleep by 9. By midnight, Darvell had 3 courses up. The wall stood roughly 2 feet high, not high enough yet. He needed at least 4 feet to make the wall feel complete, to make it feel like what it was, not a statement but a structure. Structures were not symbolic. They existed, they had mass and permanence, and they didn't care about feelings. He mixed the 4th batch at 12:20 a.m. and his phone buzzed on the workbench with a text from his sister Lenara, who lived in Atlanta and texted him odd hours sometimes because she forgot the time difference even though they were in the same zone. "You good?" was all it said. He stared at the message for a moment, then he typed back, "Working late on the patio, everything fine." That was true, he was working late, everything was fine. He laid the 4th course, then the 5th. By 2:15 in the morning, the wall was 4 feet tall on 3 sides and 3.5 feet on the rear, flush against the iron gate. He had left a small gap on the rear side, not out of mercy but because he needed to be able to exit the driveway himself. The gap was 18 inches wide, enough for a person but not for a car. He would fill it after Greta had been informed of the situation. He cleaned his tools. He rinsed the mixer drum. He stacked the remaining block along the garage wall with the leftover bags of concrete. Then he went inside, took a shower, and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He did not feel giddy, he did not feel nervous. He felt the particular calm of someone who has completed a task to specification. The wall existed now. It was plumb and level and properly mortared, and it was not going anywhere. It would not go anywhere for decades if left undisturbed. He set an alarm for 6:30 a.m. and was asleep by 2:50. He woke up before the alarm. He dressed carefully, pressed slacks, a collared shirt, good shoes. He made coffee. He stood at his kitchen window and watched the pale morning spread across the street. At 7:08, he saw Greta Halsenbach come around the corner of the block in her walking clothes, the clipboard she carried even on walks tucked under her arm, her gray hair pinned back in its usual severe arrangement. She walked to his gate. She looked at the gate. She looked through the gate. She stopped. Darvell opened his front door and stepped onto the porch. Greta turned to look at him. Her face was doing something complicated. "What is this?" she said. "Good morning," Darvell said. "That's a retaining wall." "That is around my car." "That is in my private driveway," he said, "which your car is also in without permission since approximately 6:45 last evening." She stared at him for a long moment. Her clipboard hand had gone rigid against her side. "You cannot. This is destruction of property. This is illegal. You have trapped my vehicle on purpose." "The wall is on my property," Darvell said. "I have a permit for the construction, issued by the city, stamped and filed. I can show you the permit number if that's helpful." Her mouth opened and then closed. She looked back at the wall, then at him. You planned this." "I planned a retaining wall," he said. "Your car created a scheduling conflict." There was a silence that lasted several seconds, during which Darvell could hear a mockingbird somewhere in the maple tree at the property edge cycling through its impressions of other birds. "I want my car back," she said, and her voice had dropped into something that was no longer the administrative tone she used at HOA meetings. It was smaller, more human. "I'm sure you do," Darvell said. "I want my driveway back. I've wanted it back since yesterday evening. There's a process for everything, Greta. Typically the process for accessing my property would be to ask my permission." You're going to hear from my attorney. I expect so, he said. In the meantime, I have a permit, a gate log, and 17 photographs with timestamps from last night showing your vehicle parked on my property without authorization. I also have the record of my call to the non-emergency line at 6:49 p.m. He paused. I document things carefully. You may have noticed that about me over the past 3 years. She had noticed, he could see it in the way she went still. What do you want? She said, finally. The clipboard came down from under her arm. That was significant. He had never seen her set the clipboard down voluntarily at any meeting, any walkthrough, any interaction. The clipboard was armor for her and she had just lowered it. I'd like a written acknowledgement from the HOA that my gate and driveway are private property and not subject to association access without my consent. I'd like the 2 citations I received in January reviewed and formally rescinded, since both were issued for items that fall outside the actual jurisdiction of this association under the original CC and RS. And I'd like a reasonable conversation about the fact that this organization enforces rules selectively, which I have documented in detail across 11 separate incidents over 26 months. He let that sit. Then he added, and an apology would be appropriate, though I'm not requiring it. She looked at him the way people sometimes looked at a structure they had underestimated, not with admiration exactly, but with a recalibrated understanding of its load-bearing capacity. And if I agree, she said, then I'll call someone to remove the wall today. You'd tear it down. It doesn't serve a structural purpose where it is, he said simply. I'll rebuild it where the plans call for it. She stood at the gate for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back the way she had come, her spine rigid, her clipboard held not under her arm now but down at her side, swinging slightly with each step, and that small detail that shifted posture told Darvell everything about which direction the next conversation was going to go. He went back inside and refilled his coffee. The mockingbird was still going. He listened to it from his kitchen and thought that it was a strange and remarkable thing how a bird that owned nothing could sound like everything. Part 2. By 9 o'clock that morning, Setterfield Lane had developed the specific social energy that a neighborhood gets when something extraordinary has happened and no one can stop looking. Corvin Phelps was on his porch with a mug angled toward Darvell's gate in a way that was almost theatrical in its nonchalance. 2 doors down, a woman named Priya Subramaniam stood at her mailbox retrieving nothing, because there was no mail on Tuesday mornings, which Darvell noted meant she had come outside specifically to see the situation. Even the Malvo family's teenage son, Etienne, had parked his bicycle at the curb and was staring with the unguarded honesty that only a 17-year-old can get away with. Darvell noted all of this from his front window without feeling self-conscious. He had expected it. He understood structures, and he understood that a neighborhood was a kind of structure too, a social one, with its own load-bearing elements and its own points of stress. Greta Halsenbach had been the keystone of Setterfield's social architecture for over a decade, and keystones held things in shape by exerting constant pressure on everything around them. Remove the pressure and see what actually wants to move. At 9:47, a car Darvell didn't recognize pulled up in front of his property. A man got out who was about 60, silver-haired, wearing a sport coat over a polo shirt in a way that communicated professional ambiguity. Not quite a lawyer, not quite a salesman. He introduced himself through the gate as Raymond Voss, and said he represented Greta Halsenbach in what he called a dispute resolution capacity. Is that a legal designation? Darvell asked. I'm her brother-in-law, Voss said, and at least had the decency to seem mildly embarrassed by the sport coat. She called me before she called anyone else. I told her to call me before she called anyone else. Darvell opened the pedestrian gate. Come in. They stood in the driveway beside the wall, which in the morning light looked exactly as solid and well-constructed as it was, because Darvell had not done shoddy work. The pearl Cadillac sat behind it like a ship in dry dock, its chrome catching the sun at an angle that made it look almost theatrical. Voss looked at the wall for a while. He ran his hand along the top course. He looked at the mortar lines. You're a builder, he said. Structural engineer. Voss nodded as if that explained most of what he'd needed to understand. He turned around and looked at the gate, then at the house. She's angry, he said. I want you to know that I understand why you did this. I'm not here to pretend that I don't, but she's talking about pressing charges. For what? Darvell said without any heat in it. It was a genuine question. Voss rubbed the back of his neck. She's working through the options. Unlawful detention of property was mentioned. The property is not detained. The property is in my private driveway, which it entered without my permission. The wall is entirely within my property lines, constructed on a valid permit. If she presses charges, I'll present my documentation in whatever venue she chooses. He paused. Raymond, I don't want to fight her. I want her to acknowledge what happened. I want her to stop running this neighborhood like a personal fiefdom and start administering it according to the actual governing documents. That is all I want. Voss looked at him steadily. You've done your homework. I'm an engineer. Homework is what I do. A silence passed between them that was not unfriendly. Somewhere behind them, Corvin Phelps coughed loudly from his porch in a way that might have been a cough or might have been a suppressed laugh. Let me make some calls, Voss said. He left. Darvell went inside and reviewed his documentation folder. It was thorough. It was very thorough. Across 26 months, he had photographed and filed records of 11 instances of what he considered selective or improper enforcement by the HOA under Greta's direction. He had cross-referenced each instance against the original Cedarfield CC and RS, which were filed with the county and publicly accessible, and which Greta had quietly amended, or rather, had attempted to amend through a series of board meeting minutes that were technically public record but practically invisible because she posted them on a community bulletin board that no one visited and did not distribute them digitally. 3 of those amendments, Darvell had determined, were not legally valid because they had not received the supermajority vote required for CC and R modifications under state law. He had confirmed this with a property law attorney friend named Celestine Nwasu, who lived in the city and specialized in homeowner association disputes, who had reviewed his documentation 6 weeks ago and said, with the particular quietness of someone choosing words carefully, Darvell, if you ever want to do something with this, you have a case. He had not wanted to do something with it. He had wanted to live in his house and maintain his property and be left alone. He was still not sure he wanted to do something with it, but Greta's Cadillac had made the decision more concrete than he'd planned. At 11:30 his phone rang. It was Celestine. I'm seeing something on the neighborhood app, she said. Someone posted a photo of what appears to be a car inside a cinder block enclosure at an address that I believe is yours. Yes. A pause, Darvell. I have the permit. Another pause longer. I'm going to ask you one question and I want the truth. Did you plan this before she parked there? I planned a retaining wall. I did not plan for her to park in my driveway. But when she parked there, you saw an opportunity. He considered this. I saw a scheduling conflict. Celestine made a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a laugh. You are going to need to let me handle the conversation from this point forward. I can handle the conversation. You can, she said, but the conversation is about to get bigger than your driveway. She was right about that. By noon, 3 of Darvell's neighbors had texted him. Not Corvin Phelps, who was old-fashioned and came to the actual fence to talk, but younger neighbors who had experienced their own quiet frustrations with Greta's administration and who now found themselves looking at a cinder block wall in a private driveway and feeling something they hadn't felt on Cedarfield Lane in a while, which was that the terms were negotiable. Priya Subramaniam sent him a photograph of the written warning she'd received about a wind chime that Greta had characterized as creating chronic auditory disruption to the community aesthetic. Etienne Malvois's father, a man named Christophe, texted to ask whether Darvell was actually going to pursue the CC and R issues, because the mailbox fine had never sat right with him, and he looked up the original documents after getting the citation and he had questions. At 1:15 Raymond Voss called back. She'll agree to the written acknowledgement about your driveway and gate, Voss said. The citations are harder. She's not going to want to formally rescind them because it sets a precedent. The precedent is fine, Darvell said. The precedent is actually the point. Voss sighed. He sounded tired in the way people sound when they've spent a morning being the calm person in a room where other people are not calm. What would it take, practically speaking, for you to have the wall removed today? The written acknowledgement. The citations rescinded in writing. A formal HOA meeting within 30 days to review the amendments she's added to the CC and RS since 2019 with proper notice and a proper vote, and an apology. She won't apologize. Then the wall stays until she does. This was, Darvell would later admit to Celestine, perhaps the most dramatic thing he had ever said in his life, and he had said it with the same tone he used to tell contractors that the rebar spacing in a pour was non-compliant. He was not performing. He was just communicating a load-bearing fact. The wall's removal was conditional and the conditions were clear. 3 hours later, Greta Halsenbach walked up to his front door herself. No clipboard, no vase. She was wearing a light jacket over her walking clothes and she had the look of someone who had spent time in a room alone and done some kind of accounting. Darvel opened the door before she knocked. "I owe you an apology," she said. The words came out carefully, like furniture being moved through a narrow hallway. "I parked in your driveway without permission. That was wrong." He waited. "The citations will be rescinded," she said. "Raymond will prepare the paperwork." He waited. She looked at the driveway, at the wall, at the Cadillac sitting behind it like something that had been held in suspension while the world renegotiated. "The CC and RS," she said, and something in her voice had changed, become less defended. "Some of those amendments, I know they weren't done properly. I know that. I did them the way I did because it was easier, because no one was paying attention." "People are paying attention now," Darvel said. She looked at him. For a moment he saw something in her expression that he hadn't expected, not defiance but exhaustion. 11 years was a long time to hold a structure together through force of personality. He understood that as someone who understood structures. You can't substitute personality for engineering. Eventually the load finds the weak joint. "I'll arrange the meeting," she said. 30 days. "Thank you," he said. She turned to leave, then stopped. "How long will it take to remove?" "A few hours," he said. "I'll start this afternoon." He called a crew, 2 men he worked with on demo jobs who were available that afternoon and who asked no questions beyond measurements and rate. They broke down the wall in 3 hours, loading the block and debris into a rental trailer. The concrete footing would take longer to remove, and Darvel decided to leave it to repurpose it as the actual base for the garden wall where it belonged, remixed and properly positioned. Material didn't have to be wasted. It just needed to be redirected. Greta's Cadillac rolled out of his driveway at 4:45 p.m. She didn't get out of the car when she arrived to collect it. She drove in, backed out, and drove away without looking at him, though Darvel was standing on his porch and would have been clearly visible. He watched the white car until it turned the corner. The HOA meeting happened 26 days later, not 30. 14 of the 31 households in the Cedarfield community attended in person, which was, according to Corvin Phelps, who had lived there since the beginning, more than had attended any meeting in the past 8 years. Celestine Nwasu came as Darvel's representative and advisor, and spent 40 minutes walking through the CC and R amendments with a precision that left no room for interpretation. 3 of the amendments were formally voided by majority vote. The enforcement guidelines were revised to require documentation and equal application. A new appeal process was established. Greta sat at the board table throughout. She did not leave. She voted on each item without drama and without the theatrical obstruction that some of the neighbors had expected. Afterward, Corvin Phelps said to Darvel in the parking lot of the community center that she'd seemed different. Deflated was the word he used, but Darvel thought rebalanced was more accurate. Load redistributed. Stress relieved from the single point where it had been concentrated too long. He started his actual retaining wall the following Saturday. He poured the footing in the morning and let it cure through the afternoon while he worked on the lumber framing, and by the time the light was going amber and long across the yard, he had the first 2 courses of block laid along the eastern edge, the lines clean and level. He would plant a raised bed of herbs along the upper tier: thyme, rosemary, 2 varieties of sage. He had already ordered the soil. His neighbor Priya came to the fence mid-afternoon while he was working and watched for a moment. "I removed the wind chime," she said, when she sent the warning. "You could put it back," Darvel said. "I know," Priya said. "I think I will." She looked at the wall he was building. "It's going to be nice." "It's going to be functional," he said. "Nice is a side effect." She laughed and went back inside, and Darvel turned back to his wall. The block was heavy in his hands and solid, the way real things are solid, not impressive, not performative, just present. He set the next block and pressed it level and moved to the next, and the afternoon went on around him the way afternoons do when a person has done what needed to be done and is now simply building something that will last.